Good afternoon, and welcome back to Brown Bag Speakers Forum. We are very excited to be bringing this series back. So this series is a partnership between the library. By the way, I'm Paul with Albany Library. It's a partnership with the library and the YMCA. Mary Delia is in attendance here. She was a major force behind this series, and it was going on for 10 years solid, I think, right, Mary? Maybe more even. Yeah. We've taken a little break, and now we're back with a bang. Thank you all for being here. I want to thank the Friends of the Library for making this series possible. Let me tell you just very briefly about next month. Next month, we're going to have Bob Lewis from the Audubon Society, and the talk's going to be Birds of the Bay. We've had Bob in the past. I think it's always very, very popular, so maybe arrive a little bit early for that one. That's going to be January 14th. I should say the series is held traditionally on the second Monday of each month. Small break in the summer months, around July, August, and it's at 12:30 p.m. We are recording. KALB is recording this series. It will be broadcast at, see if I can get this right, I think it's 10 a.m. Saturday, 4 p.m. Sunday on KALB, the local cable access channel. Jeremy Allen with KALB is in charge of that, and it's going to be up on their YouTube channel as well. Okay, well, without delaying further, I want to bring up Raphael Rangel with the Y to introduce our speaker for today.
Thanks, Paul. And thank you. Thanks for being here, everyone. It's really good to see you all. And like Paul said, we are very pleased to bring the Brown Bag series back. So keep your eyes and ears open. We will be having them through the winter months and beyond. So without further ado, I'm going to get started here and bring up today's featured speaker, Connie Millar. Yeah.
Let's see if we can make this work. How does the sound? Good, okay. See if we can keep it from overtones. Good, well, thank you, Raphael and Paul, Mary. I think it's fantastic. Congratulations on this partnership between the Y and the library. It seems like a wonderful opportunity to get community members together, and it's really my honor to be able to speak to my own community where I work and live myself. So thanks, Raphael. I'm going to talk today about my research. I'm a research scientist. I work at the USDA Forest Service building that's down by Ocean View School on Buchanan. And I've been as a research scientist for more than 30 years. We originally were located in Berkeley, and then the Loma Prieta earthquake condemned our building, as Mike probably remembers. So we've been in Albany for about 25 years. And I'll be talking about my work. I work in the Great Basin of the U.S., which starts at the crest of the Sierra Nevada and goes through Nevada and into western Utah. So I do work in that region. Okay, and obviously that's fine. There we go. There, yep, got it. Yeah, got it. So for half of the year, I'm very lucky. I live two lives. For half of the year, almost half of the year, I spend based out of our house. This is my husband, Jeff Winnikin. He's also around the Y. You probably see him a lot. And we have a house at Mono Lake, which is east of Yosemite, if you've been up in that area, east of the Tioga Station. So that's where I have my base. And then I work in the mountains that are along that region and also out into Nevada. And during that time, I spend virtually every day out at high elevations, up near the summits of the mountains. And then the rest of the year, I'm here, based in Albany and working down at our Forest Service building. I have office and labs there. And I am very appreciative to the Y teachers for keeping me in shape with a wonderful set of fitness classes. And it's really important because I can't just lapse during the winter. And that's, I think about them gratefully in the summer times. So I'm trained as a geneticist and working with forest trees, which is my bread and butter. But over the years, I've tackled other topics. So mostly I work in mountains, in the mountains of the Great Basin, and I work on aspects that have to do with climate. So anything that is fair game that's at the intersection of those three different topic areas. But today I'll talk about my work with trees. Trees, climate, and the Great Basin. So let's just start at first principles. What's climate? What's weather? So just as we think of a Mediterranean climate, and as Mark Twain said, climate is what you expect. So we expect in a Mediterranean climate warm, dry summers, and I can hike up to the mountains and sit on the mountaintops at 13,000 feet and be in shorts and short sleeves. But then every once in a while we get the thunderstorms and have to be prepared for that. And that's what weather is. Weather delivers us this daily variations in temperature and storms and wind patterns. So you might ask, how long a period is climate an average over? Because we hear so much about climate change these days. And really, it can be over any standard period of time. If you're interested in deep time, we might talk about tens of thousands of years, ice ages and such. But from the meteorological standpoint, weather people speak about a 30-year average. So when we talk about climate, that's, in general parlance, that's usually what folks are talking about. And for climate change, contemporary climate change, that's a good period because things are changing on that rapid a scale. So again, just at first principles, the Earth derives all of its heat, if we're concerned about warming of the Earth, from the sun. That's pretty obvious. And there is no climate change when the heat coming in from the sun equals the heat going back out. The energy balance is equal. So sun comes in, radiation comes into the Earth. There are various things that can happen to it. It can be directly reflected from the clouds. It can go down to the Earth, where because the Earth is able to absorb heat, some is absorbed and stays. Some radiation is reflected. Clouds can reflect the reflected from the Earth. So there are all these different paths that it can go. And you do the sums and balances and find that if there's more that is being trapped, and it can be trapped by what we know are these greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide being the most common. The more that it's like a blanket or like a greenhouse, the more that's there, the short waves can come through and they're trapped as long waves can't get out, so there's more heat that can accumulate. So that's really the basic physics of global warming. And this one is probably the most complicated figure I'd show. But how do we figure how much is heating and how much is cooling? Whether we do know from many, many studies that the Earth is warming, the temperatures are increasing, and that the human actions are affecting those. So everything that's in red here, these are all human actions that affect the temperature of the Earth. Everything that's in red and above this zero line is warming to the Earth. So carbon dioxide, methane is also a greenhouse gas. And all these others too, nitrous oxide, ozone, black carbon. And then those here in blue are those that cause cooling. So things like dust and ash, they actually shade the sun, and so they make things cooler. So again, you have to do the math to get whether it's warming or cooler, get the sum here. There also are these natural causes that are always underlying any human actions that are influencing the climate. So it's a very complex algorithm to figure out what's happening over the Earth's surface. But in fact, we do know that carbon dioxide levels are increasing dramatically. They're much higher than anything in the recent past. Probably millions of years ago, there have been levels this high, but we put 800,000 because we have information on an annual basis taken from ice cores down into the polar ice that can look at every year and detect the amount of CO2. So we know for at least 800,000 years there hasn't been carbon dioxide levels this high. And as a result of all of these, we know that in the last 100 or so years, global average temperatures have increased about 1.8 degree Fahrenheit. So keep that figure in mind because I'll use that as a comparison. And it's always, well, what does that mean relative to anything? Well, here's a good reference to know that in the last 120 years, there's been that much increase. So the consequences of these actions caused by humans interacting with natural are pervasive to impacts on humans, human health, flooding, agriculture, sea level rise. Of course, here in California, we know the devastation from fires, and also in nature. Similarly, sea level rises from the tropics, mangroves to the poles, polar bears, outbreaks of insects, wildfires. So these are of concern to us, and as forest scientists working with the federal government, the Forest Service, these especially are the kinds of concerns that we have scientists try to perform information, bring information to our managers so they can do conservation actions. But in addition to these concerns, we're concerned at a higher level as well, and this is my little foray out into the importance of social awareness, because it's very concerning for my colleagues and I, the distrust of science that has been happening, has been increasing and accelerating in recent years. This increase in fake news, climate illiteracy, climate denial is very, very dangerous. It's dangerous for the fate of the earth. It's dangerous for humans, societies all around the globe. So taking to the streets, taking action where we can, and I put this in, it's preaching to the choir, no doubt, but that the role of science is not something we believe or don't believe in. Science produced facts that are testable and repeatable and have very high probability. We have these two level scales of reports that have come out recently, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. This is a global report, came out in the last month. These are absolutely the best climate scientists in the world, all in unanimous agreement. And the national report, the fourth National Climate Assessment, came out the day after Thanksgiving. And our president says that he doesn't believe in it. This is really leading to actions that will be devastating for us. It would be likening it to saying, I don't believe in gravity, and leading the people of the world off a cliff. So where we can educate people who might have questions, please do. It's really important for our generation, our children's generation. Yeah,
So,
Mike.
Question. So, like less than 2 degrees, that doesn't seem like very
Yeah.
much. Are you going to talk about?
I hope we can.
It's
I hope.
more than just the average, right?
Right. I hope we can. That will become clearer. But again, I'll talk more to the topic for the day is the work that I do in mountains, and we can see what effect different levels of temperature have, at least on mountain ecosystems. And it's an important question, Mike. Averages are one thing, but the extremes are even more important. So to my work, and the work that I do has to do with how changes in climate affect mountain species. Again, being a Forest Service scientist, my role is to provide basic science information that our counterparts who work in the national forests. If you go to Tahoe, you go up through the Tahoe National Forest or the El Dorado National Forest. That's a very different branch from ours. They're the ones that do actual management on the land. They do conservation actions, and we attempt to provide information for them. So it may seem kind of esoteric, the work I do, but it's directed toward the questions that they can use to hopefully improve the future possibility of those mountain systems. So I work in the high mountains of the Great Basin, and it starts with this expectation, which is almost universally assumed to be the case, is that with warming, mountain species will shift up in elevation. And that as they go up in elevation, they run out of space because mountains have this topography like a pyramid. And if they run out of space and it continues to warm, they'll get shifted off the tops of the mountains. And eventually either populations will go extinct or even whole species will go extinct. So this is the expectation for trees and plants and bugs and small mammals. And we might ask, well, why is that the common expectation? And it derives from this atmospheric principle. If you go to Tahoe, if you go hiking in the mountains, you know from experience it gets cooler. And so why does it get cooler? Well, because there is an atmospheric principle where gases are denser nearer the Earth for various reasons, denser and pressure changes from the Earth's surface. There's more gravity. There's heat from the absorption of the sun's heat. And as you go up in elevation in a in an open air, open atmosphere, there is a standardized rate of decline of temperature of about 5.5 degrees Fahrenheit per 1,000 feet. So that's the ideal condition. That's called the standard lapse rate. And that's behind these assumptions of moving up with warming. So the idea would be, this is a Great Basin bristlecone pine, very iconic species. This is in Great Basin National Park in eastern Nevada. And these trees like a certain temperature range, and they're situated there at that elevation in the Snake Range. And the idea is that as it gets warmer, their seeds would eventually start establishing higher and higher in the mountains because of this lapse rate. So that's the background assumption. So as an historical ecologist, I look to the past and I say, well, we know there have been times that have been warmer in the past, there are times that have been colder. How have species, the trees that I work with, responded to those different temperatures in the past? And we have a really handy indicator of temperature, and that is the upper tree line. So if you're hiking up in the mountains or you're flying over to Denver or something and you look down on the mountains, you can see a point where trees no longer grow higher in the mountains. And we refer to that as upper tree line. And for decades, we've known it must have something to do with climate, but we weren't really sure. Was it snow or rain or temperature, annual temperature, extreme temperatures? But now a series of systematic studies have been done that pin it down very nicely to this one indicator where summer temperatures average 44 degrees Fahrenheit. And that has to do with how trees produce wood. Their photosynthesis machinery basically shuts off if it gets colder. So you can't maintain a tall tree any colder than that for the average in the summer. So if we look back to the past where temperatures were warmer, we would expect that tree line would go up and down. And in fact, and we have ways of knowing this, we can look back 18,000 years, which was the depth of the last ice age. It isn't really that long ago. And it was very much colder. So again, that was why I wanted you to remember that. 1.8 degree Fahrenheit. This was much colder then. That was an average temperature. And these tree species, so I work with limber pine now. It is currently the tree line species in the Great Basin, and it reaches tree line at 10,500 feet. But when it was this much colder, its upper tree line was way down here at the bottom of the mountains, where this pinyon pine, which is a woodland species and much more warmly adapted. And then from when it got warmer over the last 18,000 years, it gradually moved upslope, as we thought. So there's something where it looks like the expectations were happening over that very long time span. And here are some other species, you might recognize those names, that they also have moved up over time. So in this cases, that expectation held. And we can look over shorter time spans, and over the last 4,000 to 8,000 years, we call that the Middle Holocene. It was a time of excess heat relative to the present. In fact, from other studies, we know that it's about 3 degrees Fahrenheit warmer. Again, think of that 1.8, so a little less than twice as much warming as has happened in the last 120 years. And here is bristlecone pine now growing in the White Mountains. Have any of you been to the White Mountains? Some have, yep, east of Bishop. So this is in the rain shadow of the Sierra Nevada, so it's much drier, very high mountain ranges. These are, Campedo Peak is over 13,000. And you can see the live trees here. Because it's so dry and arid, the trees that die, they just stay on the ground. And they don't decay, they're not insect, they don't rot. And they can last on the ground up to 10,000 years. So you can see the dead stems up here much higher than the current tree line. So again, we know that trees were moving up and down over that long time scale. So now we're talking for 8,000 years rather than tens of thousands. Yeah?
Is it the bristlecone pine tree that loves to have terrible conditions?
Well, it grows up here in these pretty nasty places. But it's where it's happy. It's kind of like people saying they live in Alaska. That's it. That's it, yes. This tree can live up to 5,000 years old, and then it can sit around on the ground undecayed for another 5,000. So it is a really remarkable spot. There's an ancient bristlecone forest here. It's an interpretive site, a rec site. It's really a really neat place to go if you ever have a chance. You can drive up here on a nice paved road. There's a visitor center. You look across to the Sierra Nevada. It's a very dramatic place. And these trees take on all kinds of iconic forms and great for photography. Was there another thought? Yeah.
So, I'm confused.
Yeah.
As it gets warmer, the tree line
Moves up.
is higher.
Yep.
This is you're saying that it was higher.
It was higher when it was warmer. And so when it gets cooler,
It was warmer 4,000.
that exactly. Yeah, it was 3 degrees warmer. And then it's moved back down. So it's basically moving up and down as we expect with temperature. But you've got it right. Yep, you got it right.
So I have one other question.
Yeah.
You were saying that at 5.5 degrees difference, so that means
Yeah, right.
if it was 70 degrees here and you went 5,000 feet, 35 degrees
Exactly.
difference. And is that what, is that
Yeah, it's basically, it holds under ideal conditions.
35 degrees up there?
Cooler.
and 70 degrees
Right.
up there?
Yep. So if you go up to these White Mountains from Bishop, where it is hotter than blazes in summer, it's very cool up at elevation. But that's, again, the idealized rate, and I'm stressing that because we'll show that it doesn't always pertain. But that's correct. You've got the math right. So, and getting to exactly your point, that what we're interested in is not 10,000 years. We're not interested in 18,000 years. We're not even interested in 4,000 years. We're really interested in the next years, the next decade, maybe a century, because these are the time scales that have effect on us and affect the species and the places that we're most concerned with, that affect the water supplies, that water our cities and such. So it's a much different time scale that we're interested in. And we have to consider that things happen in very different ways on those shorter time scales, despite that we had that affirmation over long times. So my thesis for my work has been that mountains present complicated environments. They have diverse geologic histories and topography, north, south, and south slopes. They're narrow ravines, they're open slopes, the winds are different. They have diverse soils, some are deep, some are thin, some are metamorphics or granitics or volcanics, and that they present this complex environment, which might mean that species living in any one place, trees living in any one place, would experience climate differently. And then because of that, they also develop different kinds of climate. And this is more a spatially scaled phenomenon. We usually think about, when we're watching the weather, the large-scale patterns. We look at the satellite pictures over the West or over all of California. That's what's called the synoptic climate. And that's really what happens in general, is bringing the storms in. But as you move down to a spot on the ground where a tree or a shrew or a little pika is, they become ever different kinds of climates. So in the Great Basin, where there are 319 mountain ranges, the way the storms swirl around the mountain ranges and into the basins, and there are lakes and lake effects, the climate gets different because of that. If it was just an open plain, it would be very different. We call that mesoclimate. Within a mountain range, there can be all these differences in valleys and cliffs and ravines, and that affects what the climate is on any one space spot. We call that topoclimates. There can be different wind funneling, north versus south effects. And then on any one spot where a tree is growing or a little mammal is living, that's what it encounters through its lifespan. That's really a microclimate, and that can be very, very different depending on where it's situated. So for instance, this is a mountain juniper. It's a long-lived juniper. Who knows how old? That's probably hundreds of years old. But it's growing in the wind shelter of this little block of granite. That's the only climate it will ever encounter in its life. And it's certainly very different than someplace on the top of a mountain or deep down in the shelter of a ravine. So we have all this complexity to deal with. And to your point, because of that, these lapse rates vary extremely over space in mountain ranges. So if you're familiar with inversions in the Central Valley, it gets cold there, that cold air sinks. And so that would be the opposite of what I'm talking about, it getting colder as you go up. That's what we call positive lapse rate. So it's colder when you go down. And that kind of inversion, if you've thought about that, or Truckee is famous for having inversions, that can happen on tiny little scales, just little frost pockets or a little bit of a valley. So we have all of these things going on that in fact can change this atmospheric lapse rate so that it doesn't pertain. In fact, it could be much colder if you go to the top of the bristlecone forest, or it might actually be much warmer. So it can be quite a bit of difference. And those are the things that will matter on these timescales of our interest. So this is the thesis for my research, is that uphill migration is not the only response. And therefore, why is that important? We'll come back to that, in that if that assumption of everything's moving uphill, my manager counterparts might be getting it wrong about the species that they're assigned or tasked to conserve. So I try to provide the information that will help them to know how to manage and conserve species in these mountains accurately. Yeah, Mike.
Are you going to say something about how you determine these ages?
Yes.
So it's more complicated than just counting tree ranges.
Yes, yes, I'll get to that. I'll show a little bit and I'll invite you down to my lab if you're interested. So there it is. The work that we do depends on being able to date pieces of wood, both live trees and dead wood. And it probably makes more sense that dating a live tree, were you to cut it down and you'd see the rings, the center is the birth of the tree, right? And you just count out to when it was cut and you know how old it was. And if it was cut today, then it would be 2018. You count back the number of rings, and that was when it was born. So that kind of makes sense for live trees. And we have this tool called an increment borer. It's like a drill. You drill it into the tree. It's got an empty tube. You stick something we call a spoon in, and you crank it back a little. It breaks the core off, and you can pull out a core that then represents all of that cross-section of rings. So we pull those out both of live trees and of dead trees. We take those cores and we put them in a sophisticated piece of equipment called a straw. And we work as much as we can on shoestring. And we bring those down to our lab. And Diane Delaney, you might recognize her. She's in the library all the time and at the Y as well. She's my lab director. Yeah.
You're talking about the trees moving uphill. You haven't said anything about evolution of the tree.
Yes.
And to what extent is that a factor?
So evolutionary factors that would be at scales that are this level tend to be on longer.
Yeah.
So that what we're talking about, it's always happening. There are always changes in genes depending on who dies and who survives. But the ability to make changes that fast is less likely, especially for a long live tree species. So we tend to put that as a secondary mechanism, and it's not something I'd talk about today. So we put these cores, afterwards you can look at them, in a core mount. Here's Diane getting them set, and so that they then can be sanded, and you can see the rings on these. She puts this on a moving stand underneath a microscope, and she can roll this across, and as she's looking down, it's projected up onto a TV screen. And there is a crosshair, and as every time she moves it over and the crosshair goes one ring width, she presses a little button, beep, and then that all goes into a computer. And for each tree, this is one tree or dead or live tree's worth, you then get a series of ring widths in millimeters. And from that, we're able to work back and date trees that were dead. And so this is, explain this a little bit, it's called the principle of cross-dating. And so here's your live tree, and it has this pattern of ring widths that have been generated by the computer. And because the growth of the tree is related to the climate under which it's growing, in that each year is unique, it develops this ring pattern that's like a barcode. And the trees in a stand will be responding to the same climate, so they would have a similar pattern. And then if there was a dead tree that had been overlapping the time of the live tree, you can match this pattern. And then we count back, say this was 1940, let's say. You would count back even older here, and you can work back on and on back into time. Does that make some sense? Yeah, so in fact, for the bristlecone, this chronology, we call it a chronology, has been built back almost 11,000 years. So it's very cool. And from this, we can also extract information about past climates because of the ring width. So that's a basic tool that we use in our lab on trees. And now what I wanted to do in the rest of the time is go through just quickly a catalog of the different kinds of responses that I've seen in asking the question, what is the response in mountain species to changes in temperature? Do they go up? Do they go down? Do they do other things? That's the title here, up, down, and all around. So starting at the top, we have a program called the Gloria program. It's an international program based in Austria, and its goal is to look at the response of alpine species to climate change. So alpine species are the little plants that grow above the tree line in the most extreme environments. And we have 7 different stations in California and Nevada. So here we are in Yosemite National Park. This is Mount Dana, the Tioga entrance station is there. We have this one station here. And we've been looking for 20 years. We keep temperature data loggers, and the temperature has increased considerably over that time, but we haven't seen any changes in the species. They haven't moved up, they haven't moved down, they haven't died, there haven't been any species composition changes. At other sites, that's not been the same, but all of our sites in the Great Basin have just kind of hunkered in there. And we think, by and large, they're these what are called cushion plants. They're long-lived, they just don't do much. They're pretty adaptive, so we haven't seen any changes. So there's been no change in elevation, even though there's warming temperature. They're long-lived and they're adapted. Then there are situations, and you can just sort of follow this catalog along up here, where there's been no shift in elevation, but the forests have gotten denser. They've gotten thicker over time. And so here, thanks to the repeat photography, this is, again, a similar location. The Tioga entrance station is just right down there. And these subalpine forests were very sparse in the early 20th century. They were coming out of 3 centuries of what's called the Little Ice Age, when it was much colder, and in the latter part of that period was much drier. So the trees didn't grow as fast. The seedlings weren't getting established. 20th century has been warmer and wetter. So lots more seedlings get established. The trees are happier, they're growing gangbusters, but they're not moving up above their tree line. So a lot of times there's a misnomer that this is a result of fire suppression. We hear that a lot about fire suppression and causing wildfires and such, but this is not a fire suppression situation. This is not an area where landscape wildfires are happening or have happened. So this is really related to changes in climate. There are other kinds of infilling, and these might seem smaller, but if you look across the high elevations, you see what had been openings like this, and sometimes they'll have snow patches in them. But like glaciers are melting, so are former persistent snow patches. It used to be coming out of this little ice age that there would be snow patches that would last all summer in the high elevations. And if they lasted as snow, then the trees couldn't grow there. But as it's warming, the trees can come in. They come in from the edges. It's really a warming effect because it's creating all this opening. And again, it seems like a small thing, but there really were a lot of snow patches out there. So it was a pock-marked forest, and now it's pretty consistent. Another one that concerns folks a lot is the movement of trees into meadows. Here's Mona Lake, where we live in the background. And these mountain meadows are very common throughout the High Sierra and Great Basin mountains. And many of them are now converting to forests. So forests are seeding in, getting established there. This is Tuolumne Meadows in Yosemite National Park. And it's often spoken of as an invasion and thought to maybe relate to livestock grazing, former livestock grazing, but it does seem to be a response to climate. We've done a lot of studies to show that it occurs when there's a prolonged dry period. So once again, think back to this little ice age, the centuries from 1400 to about 1900. It was cold, it was wet, and in flat areas, snow melt and cold would create conditions that were best for meadows, meaning that grasses grow there better. Trees don't grow well in organic soils that have a high water table. So they're excluded. But come along the 20th century, conditions get warmer and drier, especially if there are periods that are warm enough and dry enough so that the seedlings can get established, and that even if it gets wet again, their roots are down in there. So the National Park Service, misunderstanding what was causing this, has been continuing to cut these down and try to keep the meadows. But in fact, in recent years, they've realized this is a natural process, and their mission is to allow natural processes to continue. So Tuolumne Meadows wants to be a forest, and it will probably, they'll maybe allow some areas to stay as meadow, but I think that they'll be allowing most of it to convert. So another thing that trees can do without going up or down is they can just change form. There are some species that are very plastic. So this is the iconic species of the high elevations in the Sierra, whitebark pine. And it can go from being an upright tree to this matted form. Krummholz is German for embattled wood. It was a little shrubby form that gets sheared off by the winds and the snow. And when conditions get warmer, it can start, the shoots want to go up. And if they're not cut off by the winds and the snow, they can become upright trees without ever going anywhere. So they have this ability on a very long elevational and temperature gradient to conform to whatever the conditions are. So they can also move around on different aspects. They don't have to go up and down. So here's another example where there's no shift in elevation, but in this case, I've looked back over 4,000 years and done this tree ring work to look at species in the Wasatch Range, which is a small mountain range. Here we are at Mono Lake, Yosemite's here, the state line. It's about an hour to the east near Hawthorne, Nevada. Very dry mountain range. It's in the quadruple rain shadow. And so that this species, this high elevation limber pine, grows very sparsely, almost entirely only on north slopes. You can see some dead wood in there as well. On all the other aspects that aren't northward facing, there's abundance of large dead stems that, like that situation in the White Mountains, they're just sitting there because it's so dry and very well preserved. So we can go in and we can take increment cores. Here's my colleague Bob coring a tree. Here's my increment borer. And we go through the lab again. Each one of these lines here now represents a single stem and its age. If you looked at the age down here, here's the dates. This would be the oldest tree, which is almost, or back here is the oldest, almost 4,000 years old. So we've developed this set of 500 stems looking back over 4,000 years. And if we look at the elevations from where they came on the mountains, they didn't move up or down. But we know there was a tremendous amount of temperature variability over 4,000 years. There was the Little Ice Age, there was the medieval warm period, there was the neoglacial. So there has been a lot of temperature change, but there was no apparent movement of elevation over that time. That's one thing. During these dry periods that we know from other studies were dry, that many of these slopes, again, were in such an arid mountain range, they just couldn't stand it more dry. And so there were times where the whole aspect stand was lost. You can see that was a gap. There are several aspects where trees just stopped growing, they died, and they haven't come back. The one thing that was a surprise was that that trees maintained on the north slopes continuously for 4,000 years. We might have thought that would be a good place during warm conditions, but not so good during cold because it's colder and wetter on north slopes. But in fact, the north slopes held the forests throughout all of that temperature variability. So this is one more kind of information that we give our managers, that they wouldn't expect north slopes to be a place to protect for forests. Maybe if they were thinking about moving up on north slopes, but entire north slope areas seem in the Great Basin to be what we call refugial for different climate periods. Then one more in this catalog, no shift in elevation. Trees die, but the forests get better off. And here's one that does get to your genetics question. You were asked about genetics and evolution. So there's been lots in the news about trees dying, both from bark beetles, insects, as well as drought. And it looks awful, and it seems It seems detrimental to the forests, but in some cases, and this is not a blanket statement, but in California region, the Great Basin region, we don't have as widespread epidemics of this high elevation bark beetle epidemic. It's more clustered in locations. It's caused by droughts, multi-year droughts that are especially hot. So the bark beetles are moving up into these higher elevations where they hadn't been and causing this mortality. We had 2 different situations of drought on 2 different high elevation species, and we found the same results. And that is that even where trees died, there were live trees that were of the same ages. So these trees basically are being thinned out so that the stands eventually get much sparser and thinned, and that actually allows them to be more defensive against bark beetle attacks in the future because they're stronger, they have more water, and so they can defend themselves against bark beetles in the future. So it's sort of doing the thinning job that we should be doing as the Forest Service, but it does it for us. And it also, and this is the genetic part, it turns out that the trees that survived are better able to manage to adapt, are better adapted to the current climates because they were the ones that were able to fight off the bark beetles. The ones that died were less well adapted to warming and drying. So the forest has become genetically better adapted to current conditions, which will also enable it to withstand bark beetles in the future. So it's been it's sort of a surprise, again, to what we might expect. Then we find species shifting down, which is the exact opposite from that assumption. So in many Great Basin areas where there are narrow ravines that are filled with, it's called riparian forests, but the forests that grow along streams, willows and aspen and birches, it's deeper organic soils. We don't expect pines. This is my little limber pine. It's way down in the pinyon zone. They're reproducing way below their primary elevation zone on the high mountains. And we think during these times that cold air drainage, that would be when it's a positive lapse rate rather than negative. There's less stress from drying there. And so these also may be refugial conditions. We've looked over the Great Basin. Here's California. This is then the outline of the Great Basin, Nevada, Utah, Southern Oregon. We looked at all these different species. We had records in these different mountain ranges. And if you look only at the lower 1/4 of their elevation, a much higher percentage, 63%, occur in those low elevation ravines than would be represented by that proportion of ravines on the landscape. So again, we think of these as warm climate refugia, also not something our management colleagues would be considering areas for protection. They are vulnerable to fire coming up from below, so that might be something that they could prioritize in conservation. Coming near the end now, there are a couple of situations where species do move up, but not really how we expected either. So the expectations were that species with different temperature adaptations would move kind of lockstep up. We have a situation in the eastern Sierra. This is north of Mammoth Ski Area. White Wing Mountain is currently above tree line, but a medieval forest grew here 1,200 to 650 years ago that was blown down by a volcanic eruption that had all these different species. There's no trees growing up there now. And these numbers over here are how far below the summit that species currently comes to within the summit. So for instance, Jeffrey pine grows in that area, but it only comes within 1,700 feet of the summit. These were all growing here, mixed as a mixed conifer forest. And surprisingly, this is the sugar pine, which grows only on the west slope of the Sierra. We're way on the east slope now. So it's moved. This is how much can happen in a very short time, only 400 years. It was a much warmer climate. Again, compare that to the 1.8, and it was much drier than present. So it shifted up, but there was a lot of change in species diversity. Then we see shifts up where there are leapfrog effects. And this is the White Mountains, again, east of Bishop, where bristlecone pine and limber pine are growing. bristlecone pine has traditionally been, traditionally meaning in the 20th century, a higher elevation than limber pine, but now we're finding these are all seedlings and young trees of limber pine. It's leapfrogging up over bristlecone pine. It's shifted 750 feet above its own upper tree line and is even going higher than bristlecone pine. And if we look at the dates for when this happened, in the late 20th century, we find these were periods of warm but wet summers and autumns. And it was also a time where limber pine kind of went crazy, both at mid elevations and low elevations. So that is sort of a catalog of the responses that we can see, that even though we expect them to move up, because of these complexities, they can do all kinds of other things. They can move up, down, around, change growth form, behavior, composition, and genetics. And basically, we need to know the details about each species in order to know how to respond. So again, so what? It's basic science knowledge, but our attempt is to hand it off and work with our partners so they can correctly evaluate who's vulnerable, who's really vulnerable, how to prioritize conservation, and use these understanding of this to develop management strategies that would help them best cope with climate changes coming in the future. So this subject of developing management strategies is really a giant topic in itself, but like at the end of a field day when you haven't finished, that's for another day. So if you would like to visit our lab, we would be happy to tour you. Diane loves to show folks off. She's got nice pictures. She's really good at explaining things very simply. And so don't hesitate to write me and we could set up a time. So thanks very much for your attention, and Raphael and Paul and Mary. I also have, if anyone wants to come up at the end, a piece of old wood. This is what Diane called the beauty. It was, it's a date range. It's a section of, this was a dead stem from that Wasik Mountains, and its oldest ring is minus 104, and its youngest ring is AD 910. And she put a little red pin here, which marks the birth of Christ. So it's kind of awesome to hold something that's that old and imagine that it was already growing up there for that many years before. Yeah?
I just wondered, how much of a threat is mining and leases and gas leases and all this carbonization industry that should be declining effect on the forest?
Yeah, well, certainly not in our area. I would say it's very localized. It would be more effect on local soils and such, but not other than any contributions from fracking or such to atmospheric gases, but really not a direct effect in this context. There's certainly plenty of historic mining, and and they were cutting forests for mining timbers and such, but it's much more limited now. So that's good. There is some good news. Yeah. Yeah.
So are there places other than the Great Basin, well, and even maybe in the Great Basin, that follows the expectation that as the world warms, that species and things move up? Is that?
So the question is, are there places other than the Great Basin where, in fact, we do see trees moving up with it warming? And absolutely. Yeah, and there are many studies, and sometimes the title of those studies will be Species Moving Uphill with Warming, and if you look down in the study, you'll find that maybe 25% of the species they looked at were doing that, and others were doing other things. So it's important, again, not to get hooked on these simple generalizations. It's nice because it's easy to remember. So the real world is so darn complicated. But yes, and even in my situation here, we had two cases. They just were a little more complicated than simple moving up, but they were moving up. So in fact, that is, and who knows over the very long time, we come back in 5,000 years, that might have all that noise might have settled out if we have warming for that long.
You didn't mention anything about fire.
Yes? I mean, yeah, correct.
There wasn't no forest fires?
Well, you know, one of the reasons I work at that area, at that high elevation, is that it's simpler to tease out the climate signal because there isn't fire. There is more fire now coming uphill, but working in the mid-elevation forests where there's fire, it's very complicated to figure whether it's a fire effect or a competition effect or such. So that's one of the reasons I go to the high elevations, to make it. It doesn't go anywhere, yeah. So it tends not to be an important ecological process in these high elevations. Correct. Mike?
So, besides trees, I assume it's this movement up and down.
Yeah.
Like you got grass and shrubs are moving up.
Yes.
Also, too, right?
Well, so the one example I gave was from those Alpine, that Gloria project, where those were not trees, and those weren't doing anything. But there are other cases, they weren't moving up and down. But there certainly are other cases where other species are known to move up and down and also around. And again, it depends on the species. But I also work on small mammals. I work on little American picas, which is a rabbit relative. And I work with some squirrels, and we're interested in marmots and such. And especially with the American pica, it's another story which is interesting, and it makes good pictures because it's so cute. And it actually, there's a lot of concern that it's sort of the temperate polar bear. But the short story there, the elevator talk, is that it lives in habitats that are cool. And so it's not as exposed to the warming. So if it can stay in those habitats, it's kind of like if you lived in Arizona, you wouldn't be out on the tarmac on a hot day, you'd go inside the air-conditioned building. It has air-conditioned buildings, if you will. And so that's an example where things aren't moving up, but one of other mammals like rodents and such actually are having. So it really depends on the species and its conditions. It depends on what they're eating and what they're growing and what their life history is. If they can only move 50 meters in their whole lives, they're only encountering that piece of climate. And what if they eat long-lived shrubs, they're fine. If they eat the species that's going uphill by them, then that's different. So it seems obvious when you think about those complexities, but it's, again, we so want generalities. Drifting out. Yes, they are seals and all. That's a very different story, isn't it? Right. Yeah, there are definitely lots of problems. But I think we also need to look for the good news here and what we can do, and we can take actions. And if we have the right kind of information, then we can. Great.
I always thought that the animals moved up higher because of us.
Ah.
Because they
We're worried.
people are encroaching
Yeah.
on the
Well, that's no doubt happening too, right?
Yeah, I mean, it must be a horrendous job trying to sort this all out.
Yeah, thank you. I wish you would tell my boss that. Great. Yeah, Paul.
Speaking of your efforts, in the field, about how many miles do you walk a day and how much elevation gain on average?
Well, I like to think that I'm outside 90% of the time during the summer, those 5 months. And it varies a lot. And sometimes I try to, when I'm walking, I try to calculate the numbers of cumulative numbers. And probably 5 miles, I say, on average, when I consider the whole 5 months. And there will be days when it's much longer and days when it's shorter. But I do often do a lot of driving because we work in the Nevada, and the roads in Nevada are very much different from the situation in the Sierra. So there'll be 70 miles of a bad dirt road before you even get to start walking, and there are no trails. So it's my colleagues go off to adventures in the Himalaya and such, and I say my foreign adventures are in Nevada. But I love it. It's a beautiful country.
Is it any trouble for you to adapt to such a high?
Oh, so you asked about the elevation. So I'm fortunate in not having elevation issues. You do have to acclimate slowly. So by being at our house at Mono, that's at about 6,700 feet. And then as you go up, but once I'm acclimated, I'm pretty good to go. So we'll work up to 13,000, but it's very common to be about 11,000. And I don't feel a thing at that point. So you get used to it. Yeah, maybe one more.
I just wonder with the picas.
Yeah.
Since you've been studying in those areas for so long, have you noticed changes in the pica colonies? 'Cause
Yeah.
when I've seen them a lot of times, it's around Scree.
Yes, that's where they live.
I don't
You know, there are some areas where they don't have as much capacity to move around, and those we're a little mystified by what's happening. But in general, across the Great Basin, the story is they're thriving and they are not declining. The studies that have shown decline are very specific situations that tend to be at their lowest elevation habitats, and there hadn't been studies looking at them in their more optimal part of the range. So they're, by and large, they're doing quite well.
At least the ones in your area.
In the Great Basin, but that's true in the Rocky Mountains too. So they're the only place where the concerns had been was in the Great Basin. So we've now looked at a much broader range in the Great Basin. So we feel confident for now, but things change. Yeah. Maybe we should stop. Yeah. Good. Thank you so much.